The morning Elliott Dray brought his father's watch to the Hargrove Estate Auction, he almost left it in the truck. It sat in a small cardboard box on the passenger seat, wrapped in a dish towel he'd grabbed off the kitchen counter that morning because he couldn't find anything better. The watch itself wasn't much to look at. A 1962 Hamilton Ventura electric movement, the kind they stopped making before Elliott was born. The gold casing had gone dull, the crystal had a hairline crack running from the 9 to the 12. His daughter Sophie had looked at it that morning and said very gently, "Dad, are you sure you want to bring that?" Not because she didn't understand, because she did. Elliott was 51 years old. He had the kind of face that had once been described as handsome in an uncomplicated way, and now carried the record of the last decade in every line around his eyes. He'd been a single father since Sophie was 7, after Karen died of a brain aneurysm on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while picking up groceries. He didn't talk about that much. He'd learned to carry it the way you carry something heavy, quietly, with both hands watching where you step. The watch had been his father's father's before that. The story that came with it, the one Elliott had been told exactly twice in his life, both times at the kitchen table in the house on Millbrook Road, was that it had belonged originally to a man named James Connolly, a jazz musician who'd played the Savoy Ballroom in its final years, and who'd sold the watch during a hard winter to a pawnshop on 125th Street, where Elliott's grandfather had found it in 1963 for $12. Elliott had always assumed the story was the kind families tell to make ordinary things feel important. The Hargrove Estate Auction was an annual event held on the grounds of a converted textile mill in Summerfield, Pennsylvania. It drew collectors, dealers, and the occasional curious civilian. Elliott had been hired to do mechanical work on 3 vintage vehicles being displayed at the adjacent car show that ran alongside the auction. The car work was the reason he was there. The watch was almost an afterthought. He'd mentioned it to a man named Aldous, a regular at the flea markets where Elliott sometimes sold parts on weekends, who told him Hargrove had a small jewelry and timepiece section this year, that the auctioneer had a reputation for knowing what things were worth, and that Elliott might as well get an appraisal while he was there. Sophie had come with him. She was 16 now and had inherited her mother's habit of seeing through people without appearing to try. She carried the cardboard box herself on the walk from the parking area, holding it the way you'd hold something fragile even if it didn't look fragile. The estate grounds were dressed for the occasion, linen tents, catered coffee stations. Men in blazers moving between display tables with the practiced ease of people who did this every weekend. Elliott felt the way he always felt in places like this, not intimidated exactly, but aware of his work boots, aware of the grease line along his left thumb that hadn't scrubbed out completely, aware that he was there to service the event rather than participate in it. He checked in at the vendor entrance, dropped his tools with the car crew, and told Sophie he'd meet her at the timepiece tent in 40 minutes. She was already there when he arrived. She was standing slightly to one side of the display tables, holding the cardboard box, and a woman was talking to her. Elliott recognized the woman immediately, though he'd never met her, Margaret Voss. She was the CEO of Hargrove Capital Group, the firm that sponsored and organized the auction. Elliott had seen her photo on the event materials. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a cream-colored jacket and the kind of composure that came from spending a lifetime in rooms where everyone knew who you were. "This is my dad," Sophie said when she saw Elliott approach. Her voice was level, but he knew her well enough to hear the note underneath it. Margaret Voss turned. She looked at Elliott the way people sometimes look at the help when the help has wandered into the wrong area, not hostile exactly, just assessing. "I was explaining to your daughter," she said, "that this section is for pre-registered consignments only. Walk-ins are processed at the general intake table near the south entrance. You'll want to go there first." She gestured in a direction that communicated both the location of the south entrance and the fact that she had other things to do. "I was told by the intake coordinator we could bring it directly here," Elliott said. The intake coordinator wouldn't have said that. She said it pleasantly, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once been wrong about what her own coordinators would or wouldn't say. Elliott looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at him. He took the cardboard box from her hands. "I'll find the other table," he said. The south entrance intake table was staffed by a young man named, according to his badge, Preston, who looked through a binder and confirmed that yes, Elliott Dray was registered, yes, the item was pre-cleared for the timepiece section, and that the auctioneer, Mr. Fenn, had specifically flagged the submission for a personal review. "He flagged it?" Elliott said. "When you submitted the photos online," Preston said, "Mr. Fenn put a note on your file. He wanted to look at it himself." Elliott carried the box back to the timepiece tent. Margaret Voss was now standing with a cluster of people near the premium display cases, laughing at something. She glanced over when Elliott returned. The look on her face was brief and unreadable, the kind that doesn't commit to anything. He set the box on the intake counter and unwrapped the dish towel. The Hamilton Ventura looked exactly like what it was. A 63-year-old watch that had lived a life. The auctioneer Fenn was a small, deliberate man in his late 60s with reading glasses on a cord around his neck. He came out from behind the display cases when Preston waved him over, and when he saw the watch he stopped moving for a moment in a way that was hard to define. He picked it up with both hands, he turned it over, he put his glasses on. The tent was not quiet. There were conversations, footsteps on the parquet flooring that had been laid over the grass, the ambient hum of a well-funded outdoor event. But Fenn seemed to enter a separate register of attention. He carried the watch to a work light at the back of the tent and held it there for a long time. "Where'd you get this?" he said without looking up. "My father left it to me," Elliott said. "His father bought it at a pawnshop in Harlem in 1963. Fenn set the watch down under the light and leaned over it. "Did he tell you where the pawnshop got it?" "From a musician, James Connolly. My grandfather said the man had played the Savoy." Fenn was quiet for a moment, then he straightened up and looked at Elliott directly. "Do you know what the Ventura was?" "It was the first electric watch. Hamilton made it starting in 1957. "That's right," Fenn said. "Elvis Presley wore one in Blue Hawaii. You know that?" Elliott did know that. He'd read it somewhere years ago and it had lodged in his memory the way random facts sometimes do. "I know that. This particular reference, the serial number, puts it in the first production run, 1957. There were limited examples from the first run that were sent to a promotional liaison at CBS for a television segment that was ultimately never aired. The liaison distributed several of the watches to performers he knew, jazz musicians mostly. He had a relationship with the Savoy management." Fenn picked the watch up again and turned it so the back casing caught the light. "If this is what I think it is, and I want to be careful about that word if, then the provenance you just described would fit exactly." Sophie had come to stand beside Elliott at some point during this. He hadn't noticed when. She was looking at the watch the way you look at something that has just changed shape while you were watching. "What does that mean?" she said quietly. "What is it worth?" Fenn looked at her over his glasses. "That's a conversation worth having carefully," he said. "I'd want a secondary examination before I said a number out loud, but I can tell you that a first-run Ventura with documented provenance connecting it to the early CBS promotional series sold at Sotheby's, New York 3 years ago for $87,000. He paused. "This watch has better provenance than that one did." The air in the tent didn't change. The conversations around them continued, but Elliott had the sensation of the ground shifting slightly underfoot, not unpleasantly, the way it does when you've been standing a long time and you finally move. He became aware, in the peripheral way you become aware of things, that Margaret Voss was standing nearby. She had drifted toward the intake counter during Fenn's examination. She wasn't close enough that it looked intentional. She was holding a champagne glass and talking to someone beside her, but she was close enough to hear. Fenn took the watch to the back table and spent another 20 minutes with it, using a loop and a reference catalog he retrieved from a locked cabinet. He made several calls. He wrote things down in a leather notebook. Elliott stood at the counter and waited. Sophie stood beside him and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do, and she knew it. When Fenn came back, he set the notebook on the counter and looked at Elliott for a moment before speaking. "The serial number matches a documented record in the Hamilton production archive that I have access to as a certified dealer. The archive shows this watch was pulled from standard distribution in September 1957 and redirected to a promotional account registered to a man named Leonard Carr, who was a program consultant for CBS at the time. Leonard Carr is documented in 2 oral histories of the Savoy Ballroom era as a regular presence during the final years of the venue. There are photographs of him with several musicians." He paused. "One of those musicians is a man named James Connolly." Elliott put both hands flat on the counter. "The watch needs formal authentication," Fenn said. "That takes time, but I want to be honest with you about what I'm looking at." He removed his glasses. "I've been doing this for 31 years. I've handled maybe 4 items in that time that stopped me the way this one did. The condition is extraordinary given the age. The movement is intact. The provenance chain, if you can document the pawnshop and the purchase year, is essentially complete." He looked at Elliott steadily. "You should not sell this at this auction. This item belongs at a major house. Christie's, Sotheby's, Bonham's. If the authentication holds, and I believe it will, you are looking at a value well north of $100,000, possibly significantly north." Sophie made a sound that was not quite a word. Elliott didn't make any sound at all. "Do you want me to write a preliminary letter of evaluation?" Fenn asked. "It won't be binding, but it gives you something to take to a major house." "Yes," Elliott said. "Please." While Fen went to write the letter, Elliott stood at the counter and looked at the watch sitting in the dish towel from his kitchen. The crack in the crystal caught the light from a slightly different angle than it had that morning. Or maybe it was the same angle and he was simply seeing it differently. He heard, rather than saw, Margaret Voss approach. She moved with the deliberate ease of someone who is accustomed to coming into situations on her own terms. "I owe you an apology," she said. Elliott looked at her. "I was abrupt with you earlier." She said it in the way people say things when they mean them, and also when they would very much prefer not to have to. "I assumed you were in the wrong area. That was unfair." Elliott considered several things he could say. He decided against all of them. "It's fine," he said. "It's not really," she said. "I made a judgment call based on nothing." She glanced at the watch. "Fen doesn't get excited about things. In all the years I've worked with him, I've never seen him make that many calls on a walk-in item." "I almost didn't bring it," Elliott said. She looked at him. There was something in the look, not guilt exactly, but the specific discomfort of someone recalibrating in real time. "What made you bring it?" "A friend told me to." "Good friend, yes." There was a pause that wasn't comfortable but wasn't hostile either. It was the pause of two people who had met on bad terms and were figuring out what terms they were actually on. Sophie returned from wherever she had gone. Elliott hadn't noticed her leave, holding 2 cups of coffee from the catered station. She looked at Margaret Voss, then at her father, and she handed him one of the cups without a word, which was the kind of thing she did that sometimes made him feel like she was the adult, and he was the one who needed looking after. Fen came back with the letter 15 minutes later. It was printed on the auction house letterhead and ran to 2 pages. He walked Elliott through it, pointing out the key sections: the serial number confirmation, the provenance alignment, the comparable sale, and his preliminary assessment of condition. He wrote his direct line at the bottom in ink and told Elliott to call him after the authentication process was underway. "One more thing," Fen said before Elliott folded the letter. "You mentioned your grandfather bought this for $12 in 1963. That's what my father said. Do you know what a Hamilton Ventura cost retail in 1963? Elliott shook his head. "Around $95, Fen said. "Your grandfather knew what he was buying." Elliott thought about that on the drive home. Sophie slept in the passenger seat with her head against the window, the cardboard box on her lap, both hands resting on it loosely even in sleep. The highway unspooled in the headlights and the radio played something neither of them had chosen. He thought about his grandfather in a pawn shop on 125th Street in the winter of 1963, standing in front of a glass case looking at a watch. He thought about what it meant to know the value of something when everyone else has passed it by. His grandfather had driven a delivery truck 6 days a week for 30 years. He'd never owned a new car. He'd kept the watch in the top drawer of his dresser under a folded handkerchief and wound it on Sundays. He thought about his father, who had taken the watch out once a year on his own father's birthday and worn it all day without saying much about it, and then put it back. He thought about Karen, who had held the watch the first time she saw it and said it was beautiful and meant it, and who had known, somehow the way she knew things, that it was more than what it looked like. He thought about Sophie's hands on the box, even asleep. The next morning he called Fen's number from the kitchen while the coffee brewed. Outside the window, the maple in the backyard was starting to turn. October was early this year. The leaves came down in a slow diagonal drift and covered the ground in a color that had no name except the one you gave it yourself, standing there with your coffee, in the quiet house where your daughter was still asleep. He told Fen he was ready to begin the process. Fen told him it would take 6 to 8 weeks for a full authentication and that he had a contact at Bonham's who handled estate timepieces and would make the introduction directly. Elliott thanked him and hung up. He set the phone on the counter and looked at the cardboard box, still sitting where Sophie had put it the night before, still wrapped in the dish towel, still looking like exactly what it was. He thought about the drive home and his grandfather and the pawn shop window on a winter street 60 years ago, and a man who understood that some things carry more than their own weight, that the value was never only in the object. It was in who held it and why and how long they kept it and what they passed on when they couldn't keep it anymore. He didn't know yet exactly what the watch would sell for. He didn't know if it would be 100,000 or more or something in between. He knew it would change things. Not completely, not in the ways that couldn't be changed, but in the real and concrete ways that mattered. Sophie's tuition, the roof that had needed replacing for 2 years, the breathing room that comes when you stop running the numbers in your head every night before you sleep. What he knew, standing in the kitchen with his coffee while the maple shed its October leaves in the backyard, was that his grandfather had spent $12 in 1963 on something he recognized as worth keeping. And that recognition had traveled 60 years through two men's hands and ended up in a cardboard box on a kitchen counter in Summerfield, Pennsylvania, in the care of a third man who had almost left it in the truck. He almost had. He was glad he hadn't.